Let me first start by asking you, what are the key military developments currently unfolding in northern Syria?
نحن أمام تطور مهم وخطير للغاية وهو
and
الاندفاع السريع
dangerous
لعدد من
development,
القضاء
which is
المسلحة
the fast mobilization of the factions, the militant, through the governorate of Aleppo and Idlib. And this would pose great dangers and risk with respect to redrawing the maps that been in place for the past period regarding the presence of some of the faction and the Syrian military and the possibility of intervening of the foreign parties. And of course, this would practice pressures for both all the parties and the path of the occupation of this militant to in a great and important area and military base, in addition to the size of arming owned by these factions that would let us to be before in a very different landscape of different analysis and would destabilize the areas in Syria, particularly that the Syrian president and the Syrian army announced that they are prepared for a retaliation, and therefore we are in a very decisive moment of escalation and in a great confrontation. Affirms that the eradication of the terrorism still away from the Syrian territories.
So in light of the Syrian army responding to the attacks by the armed groups to retrieve the areas, what successes have been achieved?
Till this moment, there are several reports highlighted that the current clashes in some areas that never been in the hands of the militants. The Syrian army announced that they secured some areas, that the intelligence indicates that the militants are approaching these areas, which is very important. But in return, it was the fast fell down of several and vital areas and strategic roads in Aleppo governorate that raises questions about the ideas of the fighting preparations of the Syrian armies. But I think that the state of sudden attacks made by these factions, in addition to the non-presence of support from the allies to the Syrian armies that contributed these acts, and the awaiting situation and questions into the reaction and retaliation of the army that would define the results of the matters to this conflict that poses surprise for the supervisors in the Syrian territories.
Now, Dr. Osama, this ongoing fighting has resulted in a wave of displacement. What is the impact of it on civilians in the affected areas?
This compact and fighting would lead to the flees of hundreds of thousands of the areas approached by the opposition, militant and the extremists. There is a state of fear of the inhabitants of this area, particularly that they suffered of their presence of the militant factions during the past years and suffered and affected of the attacks along with the retaliation of the Syrian armies to these strongholds. And there's a state of disturbance between these areas, and certainly we are before in a very human and harsh disaster risks as these areas suffers of the difficulties of the roads, as well as we are approaching the winter season that they suffer of lower degrees of temperatures and would lead to a great human problems, particularly that several of the human organizations do not or cannot work in these areas dominated by the militants. Therefore, these militants, rather civilians, would suffer in a state of the tensions that raised during the confrontations with these factions and the Syrian armies that they are preparing for retaliation.
Now, Dr. Osama, looking ahead, are there indications of potential escalation or de-escalation in the coming days?
Certainly, the possibles of escalations are ahead, and there are several of the militants are moving towards new cities in attempt of using the surprise confrontation that they succeeded up till now. But I think that the Syrian army and their allied forces would have some sort of a reaction in the upcoming period. In all cases, that the battles will be doubled, particularly that these militants are following the hit-and-run operation, that they may operate in their operations in different areas, as well as the arrivals of some enforcement of these factions that will try to go through different fronts, and the indicators would prevail these escalations up in upcoming periods of times.
Lastly, Dr. Osama, how do you interpret Russia's support to the Syrian army?
Russia is a great ally to the Syrian government, and the Russian role has a decisive role to marginalize the situation of the Syrian faction or the Syrian armies. And the Aleppo governorate was a part of the Turkish-Russian security coordination during the past years. And I think that the Russian support to Syria will continue, but we cannot forget that Russia is very busy in their battles on the Ukrainian confrontation that would have an impact of the support to be provided to Damascus, would affect also the size of arms and the Russian participation before this militant, and I think their realization that that situation are one of the factors that encouraged the factions to execute their latest confrontations in Aleppo and in several other areas.